Well, Jen, what's going on with Asians?
What's going on from Latinos to
happening?
Asians?
Yeah.
Yes. So for my segment today, I want to talk a little bit about the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, which of course we've all been hearing about over the last month or so. And I have some thoughts. So earlier this week, the Senate passed legislation to address the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So this was a rare instance of bipartisan consensus in the Senate, and in fact, the only senator to vote against the bill was Republican Josh Hawley. When the legislation passed, Senator Mazie Hirono, who was the lead sponsor of the bill, said in a statement, "At a time when the AAPI community is under siege, this bill is an important signal that Congress is taking anti-Asian racism and hatred seriously." So, as I mentioned, like a lot of other Asian Americans, the subject of anti-Asian violence has been on my mind a lot lately. And if you follow the news, especially if you live in a city like New York or San Francisco, where these attacks are taking place, you've probably heard reports like this.
It's at least the 7th attack on an Asian American in recent days across the city.
36-year-old Asian man, sources say, stabbed in the back in an unprovoked attack.
Another Asian-owned business in Fairfax County was targeted for crime.
It could have been my grandparents or my family member or anyone, so that's why we have to step up our game and come together, join as one.
It almost seems like racism is kind of coming back for some reason.
Kung flu. 2 other victims in Oakland's Chinatown.
Now the attention is on us, but this is nothing new.
We demand justice.
America is a melting pot.
We shouldn't be hating on each other. We should love one another and love our neighbors, love our community.
Hello, I'm Vicky Nguyen. Thank you for joining us. For the past year, many of us have been concerned about 2 viruses, the coronavirus and the racism virus. We're not only worried about our health, but our safety as well, with reports of attacks against Asian Americans, both physical and verbal, dominating our social media pages.
So things took an especially tragic turn last month, of course, when a gunman opened fire on multiple massage parlors in Atlanta, Georgia, and killed 8 people, including 6 Asian women. Not long after that, an Asian woman in New York was brutally beaten in broad daylight while her attackers shouted anti-Asian slurs and several bystanders appeared to do nothing. All of these attacks have been extremely upsetting, and as a result, we've heard multiple politicians, commentators, and activists expressing support for, quote, the Asian American community or the AAPI community. Now, I recognize that on one level, Asian American community is just the current politically correct way of saying Asian people. But I also think it's important to look at what the term community obscures, especially because politicians and other elites so often conflate concepts like constituency and community with racial identity. So first of all, the term Asian American is a census category that encompasses a wildly fragmented group of people. Today, that includes more than 20 million people from 45 ethnic groups speaking over 100 languages. 2/3 of Asians in the US and 4 out of 5 adults are first-generation immigrants. Given this staggering degree of ethnic and linguistic diversity, it's not much of a surprise that around 85% of people of Asian descent do not identify as, quote, Asian American or AAPI. They identify by their ethnicity, whether that's Vietnamese, Pakistani, or what have you. What's even more significant than this vast ethnic diversity is the fact that Asians are currently the most economically unequal racial group in the US. So according to the Pew Research Center, from 1970 to 2016, the gap in the standard of living between Asians near the top and the bottom of the income ladder nearly doubled, and the distribution of income among Asians transformed from being one of the most equal to being the most unequal among America's major racial and ethnic groups. Today, a rich Asian household is over 168 times more wealthy than a poor Asian household. So the point here is that no matter how well-intentioned it may be, a concept like Asian American community has almost no material reality. You're talking about a category that includes undocumented immigrants working as home care aides, billionaire real estate developers, Silicon Valley tech professionals, small business owners, their minimum wage employees, and all kinds of people in between. What this means when it comes to the recent spike in assaults on Asians is that the people who have been most likely to speak on behalf of the so-called community are often very far removed from the crimes that are taking place. It's important to note here that while a number of the most shocking attacks on Asians in recent months, of course, have been explicitly racially motivated, in many other instances, it's been difficult to disentangle the assaults from a more general increase in violent crime during the pandemic. As the journalist Zed Jilani points out in Newsweek, over the past year, we've seen a massive increase in violent crime, particularly shootings and homicides. In many instances, working-class Asian Americans are likely being impacted by a crime wave that is rocking American cities and impacting many people of lower socioeconomic status. So many of the working class Asian victims of recent assaults, which include restaurant and convenience store workers, were robbed or mugged in addition to possibly being targeted because of their race. So this is something that's, of course, way less likely to happen in wealthy neighborhoods. And I think that focusing exclusively on the racial element of many of these attacks with little or no attention to class leads to some curious conclusions. So after the Atlanta shootings, one Chinese American executive who works at the management firm Deloitte, where the average executive salary is over $200,000 a year, told the New York Times, "I don't think I've ever felt that degree of physical vulnerability. No matter how much money one makes, no matter how successful one is, it's the reality of being an Asian in the US." But the truth is that even amidst an uptick in hate crimes, a Deloitte executive is not as vulnerable to physical violence as a massage parlor worker, precisely because of her socioeconomic position. It's of course a good thing that professional class people are taking note of these assaults and feel personally invested in stopping them. The problem is when the political class and the commentariat then use racial identity to promote solutions that are entirely disconnected from the concerns of most working people. So, for instance, in the wake of the Atlanta shootings, Senators Tammy Duckworth and Mazie Hirono threatened to block Biden's cabinet nominees unless he promised to appoint more Asian Americans to high-level White House positions. This sentiment was echoed by a Washington Post journalist who tweeted about Biden's cabinet picks, "None of the 15 are Asian American." Now, I personally find it a little grotesque to use a mass shooting of Asian women in their workplace to bargain for influence over elite government positions, especially when we already know that the type of racial representation that Duckworth and Hirono are advocating is extremely hollow. For example, let's take a look at Elaine Chao, an Asian American woman who served as Trump's Secretary of Transportation, and prior to that, served as George W. Bush's Secretary of Labor. Now, as part of Bush's cabinet, Chao ran an extremely pro-business Department of Labor that frequently swept employer safety violations under the rug and all but turned a blind eye to rampant wage theft. In other words, Chao's policies and protocols as labor secretary probably did more to harm working-class Asians than, quote, not seeing themselves in Bush's cabinet. Furthermore, if most Asians cared about seeing themselves in the White House more than they cared about things like healthcare, wages, and education, how do you explain the fact that during the 2020 primaries, far more Asian voters cast ballots for Bernie Sanders and for Joe Biden than for Andrew Yang? Though, as I said earlier, Asians are by no means a monolith, when surveyed, the majority of Asians do say they favor bigger government in the form of increased spending on public programs, higher taxes on the rich, and universal health care. So the irony of politicians' focus on so-called racial representation is that if they truly wanted to represent Asians, they could do so by working to implement these programs. And as it turns out, these are also the types of social investments that have the potential to boost public safety by reducing poverty and ameliorating some of the social causes of crime. If we're serious about stopping AAPI hate, as the saying goes, we have to be clear-eyed about not just the economic position of most of the victims of violent crime, but also who invokes the term community and why. The increase in racially motivated attacks on Asians during the pandemic is a deeply disturbing trend that has understandably rattled people of all economic backgrounds. But we cannot let these tragedies become yet another opportunity for elites to push empty or self-serving politics in the name of racial representation.
You know, that reminds me a lot of the sort of very heated discussions that happen amongst Latinos over the term Latinx or Latino, and your segment reminded me of that because the vast majority of people in what we would call like the Latino community prefer to be identified by their, like I'm Dominican or I'm Puerto Rican or I'm Colombian or whatever, like this sort of this kind of catch-all term, which I guess would serve some sort of political use because there's strength in numbers, in a way also just obscures, like what you said, the vast differences, not just culturally, but what does a Colombian oligarch have to do with like a migrant worker in South Texas? Like literally nothing. I mean, they speak the same language. That's about it. And so maybe they like similar music, but what is that really? Yeah, maybe. So, but what is that's meaningless in so many ways. And
that's really interesting because I actually saw that about the reports that you're talking about Latinos preferring to not be called Latino, let alone Latinx, but actually identifying more with their ethnic background, precisely because when I was reading that, I was like, hey, just like Asians.
Right, exactly. And AAPI, I mean, every time I read it,
it's not real, don't worry.
I think of the AARP, like the retired people. It just sounds like
are they older or are they Asian? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it's just, I mean, that is the name of the game, right? In today's day and age, is to racialize everything, essentialize everything to race, and that has such an obscure, like in what I think was maybe a well-meaning attempt to clarify certain things whenever this kind of trend started, has become much more obscuring than it was in the past, and it's just it flattens so much. I mean, the statistics about inequality amongst Asian Americans were really remarkable. I had never seen that before, but it it makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense for those people to want to flatten those differences. Right. To wrap themselves in that mantle, to be able to flatten those differences, to protect their own position.
I mean, so in the 60s, when the term Asian American was like literally created, like literally a handful of like Ivy League students who were interested in third world solidarity. I mean, power to them, that's great. They kind of came up with this term because they were like, well, like there aren't that many of us. And, obviously like we come from different countries and different backgrounds, but we think it's important to, sort of form a cohesive identity as kind of, I guess you might say, a strategic essentialism, right? Like only when we form this identity will we be able to fight for our political interests. And that may have been compelling at the time, or I think it probably was compelling at the time. But, as you just said, what we've seen now is that there's such diversity, not just ethnically, but more importantly by income and wealth in this group, that what ends up happening is when you take a term like Asian American, or I guess even Latino, what ends up happening is the people who are the rich people in that category end up speaking for everybody. They end up pushing their favored policies forward. And so like you said, these terms, which may come from a good place or may come out of good intentions, end up obscuring more than they reveal. I think that's absolutely right.
The other weird thing that happens is that there's a kind of assumptions that are made about the political inclinations of these groups. I mean the famous example right now is Latinos breaking for Trump pretty dramatically and unexpectedly in the last election. I mean, it was just not just Cuban Americans or Venezuelan Americans.
I will say there's some early evidence that lots of Asians shifted to Trump too. So maybe we can get into the Trump shift at some point down the line. That's a whole different can of worms.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating.